You have an idea. You want to tell it to the world, but you don't know where to start. That's where Anchor comes in. They have the tools for you to edit, produce, and record your idea right from your phone or computer. It's the easiest way to reach and grow your audience. They publish for you to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major platforms. And to top it all off, they match you with advertisers so you can earn from your passion and your wonderful idea. So tell me, what are you waiting for? Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started and follow your dream. You're listening to Disruptive Adventism, a podcast about community, conversation, and conflict, where your ideas, traditions, and practices can be analyzed and changed. My name is Jose Briones, and I invite you to listen, to learn, and to live a life of purpose and disruption. Welcome back, everyone, to Disruptive Adventism. Today, we're finalizing our series on the podcasters of Adventism. By no means we are done with all of the podcasts. However, we are finalizing for now. And later on, we'll probably revisit a couple of other podcasts that are in the space and are contributing to the conversation. But today, we have brought Jeff Boyd to speak to us about the topic of pacifism and the work of Adventist Peace Fellowship, and as well, of course, the podcast that he runs. So we have Jeff, and we're going to be kind of having a little bit of an extended conversation, and he's going to be introducing us to the topic of pacifism and peace and why is it so important that as Adventists we talk about this. But Jeff is here, so how's it going, Jeff?
Good. Thanks so much for initiating this conversation.
No, thank you. Thank you for taking the time to record. I know it's it's hard to find time, especially around this time, but of the year. But it's really good to kind of like get started and have this conversation. I think it's very needed. We've been planning for maybe about a month and a half or so.
It's been a little while, yeah.
So we're making it. Jeff, get us into who you are before we kind of start talking about all these topics. Who are you and what are you doing in life?
Yeah. So I am the research support specialist at Andrews University. So that's mostly supporting grant writing and doing research conferences, hosting those. Before coming to Andrews to do that, I worked at Adventist Today magazine, and also as a research coordinator at Tiny Hands International, a nonprofit that works against human trafficking, mostly in Nepal. That's where my work was. And worked at the Red Cross, a few different things, and enjoying this time back at Andrews now.
That's awesome. Well, and you mentioned, right, of course, we are featuring a part of your podcast, here, and now you're working with Adventist Peace Fellowship, correct?
Right. So I'm the director of Adventist Peace Fellowship, and I have the podcast, Adventist Peace Radio, as part of that. And, well, I mean, it's a great podcast, so go subscribe before we actually get into the detail. But Thanks a lot.
Of course, it's a great podcast. I really enjoy your conversations. But before we get to talk maybe a little bit more about the podcast, we're going to be talking about a very needed topic in Adventism today, which is pacifism. So a couple of months ago, we had the series on law and order. And as you remember, maybe if you haven't listened to the episodes there, we talk about the different things. And two of the topics we talk about, or two interviews that we had, were with two veterans. And that kind of exhibited the position of the relationship between Adventism and the military. And that is a more combative or maybe non-combative position, depending on the stance that you take. But there are other camps, per se, within Adventism, and this is pacifism. So let's start with some definitions, Jeff. What is pacifism?
Yeah. It's actually a word that within peace studies or peace activism, it's not used a lot at this point because it came to have so many different shades and iterations, and people weren't sure. Like, there's absolute pacifism, just different practical pacifism, which gets a lot closer to just war theory. It started with a concept that people who were called pacifists were those who were against war. And then it came to mean a range of things. Those who either would be in war as non-combatants or who resisted any participation in war. And so when we say pacifist, like the next question has to be, well, what do you mean? What do you mean by that word? And so, so other words that have kind of been a part of that, non-resistors. So in the Mennonite Quaker background, that was a term kind of playing off or originating from Jesus' quote of "Don't resist the evildoer," and their understanding of what that meant to not resist. So they were called non-resistors. There's non-combatancy, non-violence, which can have a few different meanings. So someone could say, I believe in nonviolence, so I don't want to kill in war. Other people, that word can mean a different thing, nonviolent direct action. So like the civil rights movement, people would be aware of, whether that's sit-ins or, the freedom riders, nonviolent direct action that way, protests, marches. So when I was in graduate school for peace studies, maybe I should highlight that. I studied at a Mennonite seminary, did an MA in peace studies, the concentration in international development, which was through Andrews University. And so the schools have that partnership. So within peace studies, in our class, so we had a class, Christian Attitudes Toward War, Peace, and Revolution. It was a history class, 2,000 years of how Christians dealt with these issues. And our basic definition of how we use pacifism there was someone who refuses to kill in war. And so that really gets to a non-combatancy role. So it's a whole bunch of these different words that different people could use, but and shades of meaning. So like Adventists, we have this term that we use that instead of being conscientious objectors, conscientious cooperators, where, okay, I don't want to kill, but I do want to support what the military or what my country is doing. So there's that flavor. Then there are pacifists that would say, no, I don't even want to be in the military. Barry Bussey in Canada, he's working on a documentary about Canadians in World War II who had this stance and what their lives, what their experience was like, going to the work camps instead of going to the war, and then those in that group who did go in as or not as chaplains, but who went in as medics and did the medical side. So it's this whole range. Up front, you said this is an introduction, and I think that's a great way to say it because, I was mapping out different things I thought we might talk about, and it's like every section needs its own history or its own episode. Like there's early Adventist history, like there's that whole piece. Like how do we understand that? How does that play in? There's early church history, so back before the Constantinian shift. Us Adventists look at Sabbath issues through that time, and it wasn't until studying peace studies that I realized that there was the same shift going on with violence, church attitudes towards violence, and participation in that way. Early church, then there's biblical studies, New Testament, Paul, Jesus, like each one of them needs time. Adventist Peace Fellowship. Then there's the whole critique of militarism, and then just endless studies in nonviolence and all the forms that could take. And so it's like this one episode, like there's just so much I want to talk about and get into. And
yeah, I think as you're saying, like as with every area, like, the more deep that you go, like the more deep dives that you make, the more you're going to find.
Yeah.
You're going to see maybe a different perspective or maybe like a nuanced perspective here, and like maybe like, oh well, Adventists in this time were this way, or like Christians in this time were this way, or people in this time were in this way, but some of them were different.
Yeah.
And I think you make a big point here that, and the reality is that we cannot cover everything on one podcast.
Yeah.
That's just what it is. Like, that's just how it is. But I mean, we're kind of trying here. So,
we'll hit some high points.
Yeah. But tell me a little bit more about kind of like broad strokes of history within Adventism. what's the relationship between Adventist and pacifism? We're really touched on the military section. So let's give, kind of like the other side of the conversation, kind of like what can you share with us, some of the ideas between Adventism and pacifism?
There's so many Adventists who would speak to this so much better than me. Doug Morgan and Ron Osborne, the people that started Adventist Peace Fellowship, the two gentlemen, and their historical studies, Chuck Scriven, Barry Bussey, Karl-Heinz Schroeder, Kevin Burton. I mean, George Knight, right, who had his roots or taught here at Andrews so long. I mean, these historians that are just really dig into this. But so for getting ready for this podcast, I pulled out a paper I wrote in 2009. Since I've forgotten more history than I remember. So in that class I mentioned, Christian Attitudes to War, Peace, and Revolution, I wrote a little paper for class just covering that history, trying to learn about it. It's like I had an undergrad religion degree. I've gone to Adventist schools all my life until graduate school and little other classes along the way at public universities. But it was really steeped in Adventist education. I just didn't learn this stuff. We didn't get into it. It wasn't until I went to a Mennonite seminary and started digging into this and realized our history and how we had viewed these things. Like when I was in high school, I did go to public school my senior year. And when the Marine recruiter came and talked to me and I gave him my phone number, and we were talking about it, eventually it didn't fit what I was wanting to do at the time, but I had no background to deal with that conversation. I had no basis, like no religion teachers or ethics teachers, or it just wasn't talked about. And so I just had nothing. And so for me, it was a real learning experience to start digging into this history and realize how strong our early stance was, thinking. And Kevin Burton would definitely remind us that, and George and I, they've both made this point, that it wasn't universal, but we had a strong stance of not participating in militarism. I mean, two people were disfellowshipped because they joined the Civil War that they wanted to fight in that. They were disfellowshipped, and that continued. I have these quotes here that I don't know that stand out to me, but Peter Brock, he has this book, Freedom from Violence. He has a whole chapter on Adventists. It's all about different groups that were either non-combatant, were pacifist, or had that in some way. And he talks about how early Adventism, from the mid-1850s, we had pacifist articles in the Adventist Review and Sabbath Herald. So that's well before Civil War starts. I mean, things are at play, but and then when it started, the early Adventist church wasn't exactly sure what to do. James White wrote an article in the Review called "The Nation." It was he basically said, if the government makes you do it, then you do it, and it's the government's fault. So and there was just this huge backlash, like, no way, that's not, we dare to be a Daniel. We stand up, and when the whole nation bows down, we stand, we're true. It doesn't matter what the government does to us. We stand for what we believe. And there was this whole back and forth. And finally, because they just hadn't wrestled with this before. It's like they were making this up without knowing the 2,000 years history of how Christians had wrestled with these questions. And came to that stance that they wouldn't join, they wouldn't participate, even though they were strongly against slavery and they supported the North. So Ellen White eventually, she had strong statements against participating in it. And then it continues. The General Conference gave official statements about not participating. I quoted a few of them here. So one particular quote from the General Conference statement in 1865 says, while we cheerfully render to Caesar the things which the Scriptures show to be his, we are compelled to decline all participation in acts of war and bloodshed as being inconsistent with the duties enjoined upon us by our divine Master toward our enemies and toward all mankind. And there were two more after that, 1867. that they resolve the bearing of arms or engaging in war as a direct violation of the teachings of our Savior, spirit, and letter of the law of God. Again, in 1868, we request our brethren to abstain from worldly strife of every nature, believing that war was never justified except under the immediate direction of God. So it gets back into a theocracy there. But there were these pamphlets released, 3 different pamphlets that were used to help promote non-combatancy or just not participating in the Civil War. So let me ask a question. Do you still have show notes for the podcast, like on the blog, on the
for which one?
For this so if people go to disruptiveadventism.org, they click on the blog, do you still have?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So we could put some of these resources there. Mm-hmm. There's so many, like, linking to these, that the church took the stance. They were officially given the stance of non-combatants, along with Mennonites and Quakers, that they, it glosses over a lot of that history. There's a lot more, but it was just a central, important facet, not universal, but dominant. And I didn't know anything about it before going into this. Like, when I went into peace studies, I was not a pacifist. Like, I just knew I wanted to work for peace, and that's such a broad topic. There were certain things I wanted to do towards it. But I wasn't a pacifist going into it. I'd never, like, all those arguments for pacifism, I just wasn't even aware of. Like, it wasn't on my radar. It wasn't like, I grew up a normal American kid. Like, I had played with my little G.I. Joe guys, my teen years. I'm watching Arnold Schwarzenegger and, whoever. And later developed, through different influences, some of these convictions. But it wasn't, it was a real surprise to me to learn that this was our history. Like, what? We said that?
So some of the things that you're saying here, when it comes to, like, the General Conference, and it seems really strong.
Yeah.
But someone listening may be saying, well, that was in 1860.
Yeah.
1870s is very old. So what changed within Adventism that kind of moved us towards a more cooperating with the government or military or things like that? And instead of having this, I don't know, maybe call it rebellious stance.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Like, I think Osborne has one paper where I think he quotes Chomsky, and I don't remember the paper right now. Maybe I can definitely go through my stack and I'll put it in the show notes. I put it in the comments of the podcast. But he kind of quotes Chomsky and, like, this civil disobedience, like, revolution that you kind of have to have, like, that was kind of like in the fabric of Adventism. But what changed?
Yeah, it is a beautiful, without going into it too much here, it was just an incredible protest. I mean, yeah, great history. And I think we went through a pretty standard progression that sociologists have noted with denominations. They start out as sects at the margins, and that process of being institutionalized and moving away from the margin of society, there's some pretty standard movements that we fall right in line with, that the more we become want to be part of society, not a separate, peculiar people. And so it was a slow process. It was a slow process of accommodating and becoming more comfortable with culture and participating in those ways. And our military participation was just one of the many things that kind of shifted as we developed as a denomination into a denomination, from a movement, sect, denomination, institutionalization. Denny Fortin here in the seminary has a recent presentation on that process and how we go right with it. And so pretty much through each successive major military, I should interject that I'm talking about U.S. history here, and talking about European history, talking about other Asian Adventists, thinking of those in South Korea, and a lot of different experiences, and so I'm definitely speaking to that from this perspective of North American Adventism. That for each, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, each time we're gradually more comfortable being apart, still promoting promoting medical participation as medics, so that there isn't killing involved, and it's okay to do medical work on Sabbath, so that kind of gets you around both of those things. The Medical Cadet Corps, so at Vietnam, by that point, the church said we encourage non-combatancy, but you can be an Adventist in good standing and go either way from that, either participating as participating in active duty, or being a pacifist and totally rejecting participation. And so we've just kind of gone through that slowly to the point now that it's not even an issue. And honestly, I should interject here two things that probably be are two things that are important to me to clarify. One is I believe in Big Tent Adventism, and this applies to a lot of things. In this case, it's about military, because that's what we're discussing. So, not second-class Adventists. We're all Adventists. Like, I have friends in the military. I have family that have been in the military. Like, respect all the way around. Like, it's just this is the journey that I've been on, and these are the convictions and things that I've come to later I came to it in my 30s. I'm in my 40s now, and I've tried to process through how to live these things over this time. But so Big Tent Adventism, we can disagree. People who are equally intelligent, spiritual, and dedicated can have different views. We're all Adventists. We all worship together. We each explain our side. We listen to each other. And this is the journey we're on. And so definitely believe in Big Tent Adventism. And here that means pacifists and soldiers. We're stand together. We do. So that's the one thing. The second thing is that while I'm talking about pacifism generally, I need to clarify that the Adventist Peace Fellowship is not purely a pacifist organization. So in just war theory, there's one of the criteria is that violence is a last resort. It's the last means. Well, that if violence was the last resort, then you must have been doing a lot of nonviolent things along the way. And so we have so much to do together. It's just that last decision, should I now kill or not, based on this? That's where we can disagree. But we're still in this whole journey together to be peacemakers. Like, every disciple of Jesus is called to be a peacemaker, regardless of how you come down on that war question. And I think that was a good clarification. Glenn Stassen, in his book, Just Peacemaking, would you believe? The first 40 or 50 pages is about this pacifism versus just war. And then at the end, we're all still called to peacemaking. So how can we do it? And so he highlights 10 ways that we can work for peacemaking.
You mentioned that Adventist Peace Fellowship is, non-fully pacifist, but, there's kind of some encourages the activities of nonviolence and encourages activities that are, kind of using nonviolence as a means towards achieving a goal. Violence may be warranted as a last result, but like you said, there are activities that need to be done all throughout. So but explain to us, maybe some listeners have not known or being yet introduced to what is the work of Adventist Peace Fellowship. And, we kind of had this little introduction to pacifism, but what's the next thing? How does Adventist Peace Fellowship work?
Yeah. That's a good place to turn that corner. So sometimes when I have given presentations on Adventist Peace Fellowship, I kind of go through those three words. So the Adventist side, looking at Adventist history, and there's just so much that active, not just avoiding war, but proactive seeking the good of the world. demonstrating God's love, God's compassion. There's so much proactive, not just passive, Passive, but really active. It's an active faith. We have an active history it's really meaningful. The history of Adventist social action. It's actually startling to me how rich it is, that I didn't know about. So there's that. Then the peace is, we in the Adventist Peace Fellowship have tried to approach better that biblical shalom. When we started 2001, the major question was war, and what should we do about the war on terror, and how can Adventists interact? So the Adventist Peace Fellowship is part of a community. Just about every denomination has a peace fellowship. So there's Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, Baptist Peace Fellowship, Catholics, there's Pax Christi. It's pretty common. So they started one for Adventists. So Adventists who want to get into these themes, here's a community, here's people who are asking similar questions, looking for similar resources. And it was looking at this history of non-combatancy and trying to think through, okay, what does this history mean for us today given a war on terror? So when Ron took over, he helped us think through a range of issues. And so he and the team at the time came up with 6 areas to work on. So I'll just read those off. So the first one is what people think of as peace. So peacemaking and reconciliation, care for creation, so the environmental side, Sabbath economics, this whole economic justice side of the Sabbath that Tony Campolo was at Union College once. I was out there speaking for their peace class, and they shared he'd been on campus, and they said, why don't you follow the Sabbath? And he said, why don't you follow Sabbath economics? Let's dig into this deeper.
What is essentially the Sabbath economic? That's maybe something that some people may have been, I've heard about the Sabbath, but what is this Sabbath economics that you're speaking of?
Yeah. It's so starting from, Sabbath is rest, and so we start there, and then the teachings on the sabbatical year, rest for the land, rest for people, slaves going free, forgiveness of debts, and then 50, so these cycles of years to the 49th, 50th year, just deep economic ramification. And it's all under Sabbath language, Sabbath teachings, just not seventh day Sabbath. And so the implications of that. So then the fourth area is health and human rights. Next is freedom of conscience. So that's like freedom of religion and like what we're talking about with militarism, freedom of conscience there. And then finally, racial and gender justice. So there's definite overlap of those, but it's like, okay, how can we live these out? And so we're trying to find ways to embody this bigger concept of shalom. And so we try and encourage that in a number of different ways. We have a Peace Church network. We'd love to have more congregations join that. So that's AdventistPeace.org/churches, where pastors, lay people can get involved. We've tried to promote university chapters. So our first chapter was actually here at Andrews University. 2 grad students helped start that, and we're trying to get that restarted. Southern Adventist University has a chapter. They're doing some really good stuff. So trying to find ways to live out these things in the local congregation, the local university. We're very grassroots. It's not like the leadership team sets out, okay, you need to do this, this, and this if you want to join. These are our commitments. These are our rationale, and that we're a network of trying to bring people together. So you're working on it. Okay, how can I promote that on the blog? And how can I do a similar thing at my church to what you're doing? And this whole networking of people is what we're trying to do.
Well, it seems like you have a lot in your hands, and there's a lot to kind of like different arenas, the written word and maybe speaking, about issues and about different things. Something that you really mentioned and that I really appreciate, that this is part of the larger conversation in Adventism right now, is how to bring this resistance from the Sabbath perspective. The Sabbath brings a lot of peace, especially to our busy lives.
Yeah.
But how to bring that peace into different areas of the conversation, such as racial reconciliation, gender reconciliation, egalitarianism, like, whole conversations that we need to have, and they need their own podcasts.
Yes, yeah.
For sure. This will not be the podcast to hit all of them, besides, all of the information that you kind of have given us on pacifism as a whole. But as it is our series right now that we're kind of finalizing on this topic is the series on the podcasters of Adventism. So there is a podcast component to the Adventist Peace Fellowship as well. So explain to us a little bit more, what is unique about this podcast in comparison to all of the other Adventist podcasts that are out there?
Oh, yeah. So there's definite overlap. I mean, there's overlap between Adventist Peace Radio and this Disruptive Adventism. I mean, we've had a number of common people, of just amazing people. And Adventist history, so overlap there. But so our focus is looking for Adventists who are active, active in some way socially, whether that's in politics or that's in racial reconciliation, any of those areas that I mentioned, those 6 areas, to look at, to try and get at what are Adventists doing. And I wish I had more time to keep the podcast going. I get more ideas than the list just keeps getting longer. We can't pump out episodes as fast as we're getting topics. And so we, interestingly, we actually haven't had a military episode yet. Like, there's just so many other topics that we talk about. We do have one coming up, but just so many other issues. So, Michael Nixon we've had on a few different times. Michael Nixon and Tiffany Llewellyn have been they're the most recurring guests. So it's always great to have them. So Tiffany Llewellyn is head of Adventists for Social Justice, and her perspective that she brings to things. So a lot of things, and how this got started is maybe sheds a little light on what we're doing. So when I worked for Adventist Today, I started on the news team, and then I was the managing editor. And I had this, before I was working there, I had this interview series. So I started a blog. It was Adventist Activism. We later changed the name to Adventist for Social Action. And I had this interview series with Adventist activists. We did 15 or 20 written, transcribed. So I do an interview and then we transcribe it, post it on Adventist Today. So who are Adventists who are doing stuff? And so it was all like from pastors to political people to just this whole range. But in the editing process, I was just losing the voice. Like their passion just wasn't coming across the same. It's like the information is there. Like this is solid conversation. Like I want other Adventists to know what these people are doing and stuff, but it's just not. It's not coming across. And so I was listening to podcasts. I love podcasts. And I was like, oh man, how could I do that? Could I really pull it off? And so Michael Nixon and I talked to some other friends, and Michael and I were both starting. He was starting the Ingredients podcast, and I was starting Adventist Peace Radio. And so we were kind of helping each other figure out what to do. And the people at the Iconocast, they were helpful. Love that podcast. They were really helpful in getting started, like how to bring these stories alive, how to... And so it was still those social justice themes, peacemaking, social ethics. Like the term I usually use for things is applied Christian social ethics. It's like it's Christian, it's ethics, but it's active. It's not just theoretical. It's like, how are we living this stuff out? Just all these different ways. Like, is that church-based service, or is it more like advocacy? It's this whole range of things. So it's been fun to develop into it from the written interviews to now the spoken. And I almost didn't do it because I hate the sound of my voice. Like when I hear recordings, I'm like, oh man. And so I when I transcribe those interviews, I hear myself like like that was just like a barrier for me to do it. And finally, interestingly, it was Diane Rehm, NPR. She's so amazing. Like I love her interview. Like she's so brilliant. But I would never hire her for that job because of the sound of her voice. Like her voice is not a typical radio voice, but it didn't hold her back. And I was like, if Diane Rehm, she found a way, like despite that medical condition, like that she can have a brilliant radio show, like, okay, I just need to do this, get past myself. learn along the way. Like these voices, they need to be heard. Get over yourself and let them speak. And so that's where it came from.
I can definitely agree with that. And, my voice is not the best voice for podcasting, but, like I definitely resonate with that thought. It's just like, you know what? It doesn't matter. And if you're out there and you want to start a podcast, just do it.
Yes. Yes.
You start with what you have, and you work your way up. Like, that's just what it is. I mean, hopefully one day we'll be like NPR.
Yeah.
But maybe that day is far from now, but we're trying to work our way there. But yes, like, I guess like, I empathize with that thought of like, yeah, my voice is not perfect, but I still want to put those stories out there, like your story, or like, the stories of others that we have featured. And I think that's just such a powerful work. Now let's go into a little bit like the last area that I guess we'll touch on for this podcast today. And is, what are some of the challenges that you have had as a podcaster and as a director of Adventist Peace Fellowship to kind of get the message out there?
My biggest one is time. Priorities. Because so I have a regular, full-time job, come home and have, wife and a toddler and dishes to do and laundry to wash. And then when that's done, there's a nonprofit, national, international nonprofit I need to be working on. And then when things are kind of taken care of, I can get to the podcast. And so I would just love to, so I try and prioritize. I still do definitely have room to grow in using my time well. But that dedication to making it a priority to keep at it. And on our podcast, we do two things, and I also got this from the Iconocast. We have interviews, like this. That's most of what we do, but we also do presentations. So whether that's sermons, presentations at a conference, different things like that. And so sometimes those sermons can help cover a time span where I don't have time to set up and conduct and edit and interview, and so those can help cover, because they're just great content out there too with people's presentations. So it's and time gets to a lot of things. I mean, there's so much time that it takes for promotion. Like besides recording and editing, it takes time to promote a podcast, and so the more people you can have on a team helping out, definitely the better. That's an area I still have to improve in. And like the Iconocast, they have people that record and then they send it to the editor, and that's just definitely superior. Like at this point, I do each stage in it. But teams, that old saying, teamwork makes the dream work.
I agree. And that's why I am thankful for my team. I just want to shout out to them. It's really great that they are working with me. And we do all our little bit, and, we make it happen. But yes, it is a lot of time, and it's time consuming. So, but we're really glad that you're in the space and that you're promoting and creating conversation. I think that's something that we all are thankful.
Man, and I'm thankful for you. Like your list of guests, the topics you hit, like that's it's excellent. Yeah, it needs to be out there.
No, thanks a bunch. We try. But how can we find you? Like, if someone's listening, it's like, well, sign up, Jeff. I want to hear more about pacifism. I want to hear more about Sabbath economics, about topics that I may not be aware of like our tradition of pacifism in the Adventist Church. And of course, read your paper.
Yeah.
Of course, read that paper, kind of like get some extra information about how to, understand the world from a pacifist Adventist peace perspective, not necessarily a pacifist perspective, but from a peaceful Adventist perspective. How can we find your podcast and other resources?
Yeah, so Adventist Peace Radio, we're on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play. The easiest, so you can Google that, or adventistpeace.org/podcast. They're all listed there. They're also listed in the blog. It'd be great to have people join up, follow. Good. I've got a whole lineup of conversations that we're going to be recording in the new year. So much on the website. historical documents, essays in the blog. We would just love for more people to connect, get on the email list that's there, and check out the page of Adventist Peacemakers, people that I wasn't aware of before, and so just learning like who are these people throughout our history, and we're always adding more names, more people, and discovering what this rich history is.
Awesome. Well, that's how you can find them. And well, as it is our tradition here at Disruptive Adventism, we like to give the final word to our guest. So, Jeff, tell me, what is the final word on all of these topics: pacifism, Adventist Peace Fellowship, peace studies, or peace as a whole, whatever you want to say. Go ahead.
Yeah. To me, it's about discipleship. So starting with Scripture, starting with prayer, there's so much about peace themes, peace and justice in the Bible, and that's where it's grounded for me. It's not a political stance. It's following the Prince of Peace, who brought the gospel of peace, who breaks down the wall between people groups. And so the more that we commit to Jesus, to the Sermon on the Mount, to the way of Jesus, it's not natural for any of us to begin embracing carrying our cross. And that is, I think, at the center of peacemaking, dying to myself so that I can live for others, live for God and the mission that He sent us on, and just to mine the Scriptures for the heart of God in these peace themes, like that. This is that the peacemakers are the children of God. That we all need to grow in this, and it is an absolute journey. Like I see these things differently now. I live them out differently now than I did 10, 20 years ago, and it's going to be the same for the next 10, 20. And so for each in that discipleship journey, mindful that peace is an important theme, and to look for it, be alert to it, search for it, pray for God's wisdom to live it out. It's a spiritual journey above anything else.
You've been listening to Disruptive Adventism. We hope that today's topic helped you to think and change something about your practices, about your faith, about your Adventism. If you want to subscribe, make sure to go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcast. We'll be there. And make sure to give us a review if you like what you're listening to. If you want to support, make sure to go to patreon.com/disruptiveadventism. It helps us pay our bills and produce the content that you're listening to. And if you want to socialize, make sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram or on Twitter, and hit us up whenever you need anything. We'll be there to support you. Thank you for listening today. We hope you join us next time. And as always, we invite you to be disruptive.